Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Cutting Room Floor. Pastor Rob here. I want to take you a little deeper into one of the passages, one of the messages that we looked at here recently at Sunny Slope. And today we're looking at a story that I think presents some real challenges. It's maybe hard for us to wrap our minds around this. We looked this past Sunday at the story of Nadab and Abihu. They were two priests. In fact, they're the very first priests who entered into the tabernacle to minister, and they were killed immediately for doing it in a way that God had not authorized. We spent a little bit of time this past week looking at the sort of the ins and outs of that story, the meaning and the message of it. Now I want to take you to a different story and maybe just draw some parallels to it, just some connections to it. So let me put the screen up. I'll put it on the screen in front of you so that you can kind of follow along. This is the book of Acts, chapter 5. And the stories are not exactly one for one the same, but there are enough similarities that I think perhaps were meant to make some at least subtle connections in our mind. In Leviticus chapter 10, we start out with two people, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. And in Acts chapter 5, Ananias and his wife Sapphira. Both of them act in a way that was not right in God's sight. In the case of Nadab and Abihu, as we saw, they each took their censer and they offered unauthorized fire. Ananias and Sapphira kept back for himself some of the proceeds and laid it at the apostles' feet. When they do this, in both cases, you'll notice that in the case of Ananias, or in the case of Nadab and Abihu, the fire comes out and consumes them, and they died before the Lord. And we also read that in Acts chapter 5. The story is told a little bit differently, but Ananias hears these words, he fell down dead and breathed his last. So you can kind of see here, and then a little bit later, his wife, in Acts chapter 5, Ananias' wife Sapphira comes in, and immediately she fell down and breathed her last. So again, there's a connection here between their death, but then together, I think there's at least, a connection between the fact that both of these people die. When that happens, again, the young men come, they found her dead, and they carried her out and buried her. Now, in the in the story of Nadab and Abihu, again, you see they carried the cousins of, depending on how you interpret a couple of Hebrew terms there, the cousins of Nadab and Abihu do something similar. They also come in and carry them in their coats outside of the camp. And so there's a similar thing here, that Nadab and Abihu, they're carried out of the tabernacle, and then Ananias and Sapphira are also carried out and buried. The final thing I think to notice is the reaction of the people. In the story of Nadab and Abihu, on the one hand, the priests here are told they're not to mourn. There's a reason for that. We spent a little time talking about that in the message, but they're specifically told not to mourn, lest wrath come upon the entire congregation. In a little bit later on, I'll see if I can't scroll down and just show you. Later on in the story of Ananias and Sapphira, the story of Nadab and Abihu, you actually find out that the people, the whole of the people, do grieve the death of Nadab and Abihu. So even though the priests were not to do that, the whole house of Israel was permitted, the whole congregation was permitted to grieve. And you can imagine that there was a fear that came upon the people of Israel in that time. You actually read the response of Aaron. It's a little bit earlier here in the text. Aaron, you can see he actually, at the end of all of this, Aaron holds his peace, which is a sort of a silence before God. the outcome here is a fear comes upon the whole church and all who heard these things. The a couple of other maybe just little similarities here. It's Moses comes and speaks to Aaron, just as Peter comes and speaks to Ananias, and later on to Sapphira. So there's that connection as well. The point of all of this is to recognize that I think there is at least a thematic connection between these two stories, and they both have a couple of other things in common that are not so much linguistic, but more thematic. In both these cases, you have the beginning of a new period of time in Israel and the church, respectively. And so, in the case of Nadab and Abihu, the work of the priests is just beginning, and so you have this: the God has made this way for His presence to dwell among His people, and He's ordained and He's appointed priests to be the ones to mediate that presence. But right away, Nadab and Abihu decide to do things in their own way, and so the idea here is that if the first person performing these rites and these rituals is allowed to do it wrong, or is allowed to, if God sort of just tolerates it and lowers His standards, that because of that leadership position, that can creep in and corrupt the entire people, right? Sin has this way of spreading, and so the concern there that God has is that right from the beginning, He not permits sin to spread. And so leaders being held to this higher standard are punished immediately. And the same would have been true in the New Testament. As the New Testament church is just beginning, it's just beginning to unfold. The question is, would God allow corruption in at the very beginning? Because if He were to do so, that corruption and that sin might be allowed to spread and sort of take hold in the church, and it would set an example then would be permitted to perpetuate. The second theme, and I think the second parallel that both stories are meant to emphasize, I'm going to bring up my screen one more time just because I think this is worth sharing, because in both cases it's the same. In Leviticus chapter 10, right, when God speaks, his claim is this: I will be sanctified, and before all people I will be glorified. And in Acts chapter 5, there's this same outcome as well, a great fear that came upon the whole church. God's desire is for His name to be feared and revered. God's not about simply making people afraid just for the sake of torturing them and making people afraid. He desires to be revered and glorified because He's worthy of that. He alone is deserving of that. And so in both cases, what God is doing is He's reinforcing the holiness of His name. He's reinforcing the glory and the majesty that He is deserving. And we take that lightly at our own peril. We ought not to downplay or diminish the holiness of God. We ought to revere the nature and the character of God. And both these stories emphasize that in different ways. Both of them at the beginning of these new significant chapters in redemptive history. Both of them show the sort of the human tendency to flaunt or downplay the righteousness and holiness of God, and both show that God intends to uphold His holy name and to defend and to guard against it. So that's just a couple little parallels there that I thought were maybe worth pointing out. The next time, join me. We'll do it again on the cutting room floor. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.